Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we will be discussing about OAuth 2 standard for securing our API endpoints. Alright, and this whole newsletter article that I'm presenting, that I have written, you can find this particular article on suchet.substack.com, and then you can go through it in depth. So now let's quickly begin with it. The OAuth 2. So OAuth stands for Open Authorization. So before doing a deep dive into OAuth, first understand that what is the problem that OAuth 2 solves today, right? So we have a lot of services today as part of the organization deployments, the solution architecture. You have a lot of services in place. Now the question is the all resources. When I say resources, means the APIs. Consider APIs for now. So API, how can you secure your APIs, or how can you make sure that your API is only being accessed from a trusted source, right? From a trusted origin. So this is the problem with statement, right? And this is where a lot of things comes into. So this is where your authentication comes into. This is where your authorization comes into. So in order to secure your endpoint, you will have to ensure two things, right? You will have to ensure your authentication, and you will also have to ensure your authorization, right? So if you look at this diagram, it's very basic diagram. So let's say it's your application server, and then you have an API which is now being hosted on internet. Now, but you don't want this API to be accessed by anyone. Whoever know the path can access your API. You don't want that. What you want is, you want whoever person or user you allow to access can only access this particular API, right? So this is where the concept of protected APIs comes in. Protected API means that you have an API, now you are protecting it. The way you are protecting it is using authentication and authorization. Now there could be multiple ways, but in this video, as part of this lecture, majorly we will be talking about OAuth 2 standard. Alright, so now before doing deep dive, let's also understand then what is authentication and what is authorization. I'm sure that most of you guys, if you're watching my video, like 80% of the guys must be confused between the authentication versus authorization, right? So authentication defines who you are, right? And you, even if you in today's world, you've seen that a lot of OTP comes to your phone, right? That is again a way of your authentication. So an authorization, so let's say you have your username and password. You are entering your username and password at a place, at a website, an application. So that username and password defines that, okay, you have an identity here, right? And then you are authenticated. You are the correct person to use this. Authorization say you are this particular person. I have so many resources, right? But you cannot access each resources, right? So for example, let's say in a house, you own a house, and then you live in that particular house, and then you have your family members here. Guest comes in, the guest sits basically in the guest area, right? Not everywhere. So because guest doesn't have that access to sit anywhere, right? So you might have your personal bedroom. So those kind of things. So that is defined by authorization. What are the things, what are the resources that you have permission to access to? So this is something which is defined by your authorization. Alright, so when you talk about authorization, there are two things. As I said, the role and permission. So what role do you have? So for example, in your organization, you may have a CEO, CTO role, right? These are executive roles. So the access they have, it doesn't mean that you will have the same access. If you are a developer or QA, that means you will only have the read access maybe, or somewhere the write access, right? But you won't have access to each of the resources, because nobody can expose all resources to a developer or QA. So accordingly, as per the hierarchy goes up, you might have the more number of permissions. So that your permission and roles, that's the concept. Now, so we understood, right? Authentication, authorization. Now let's talk about your OAuth 2. So majorly, I'll tell you the place where your authorization comes into the play, right? That is, you see, enables a third-party application to obtain a limited access to HTTP service. So let's say you have a resource, right? There is a website. In your day in day out, you must be accessing a lot of website, and then you might be using a feature, login using Google, login using your Microsoft Outlook account. So or maybe you're using Facebook, etc., etc. The concept works in that particular website that you want to access has resources, right? But that doesn't has your identity. Who has your identity? Google has your identity. So you see, Google as an authorization server, you are the resource owner, and then that guy, the website and web application who's hosting your resources, the resources you want to access to, has the resources now but doesn't has your identity. So this particular web application will be assumed as the third party. Now this third party wants to verify your identity using Google as an authorization server. So this is where your OAuth 2 comes in, right? So earlier we used to have OAuth, but now later on nobody use it. So now you have an upgraded version of it, Open Authorization 2. So this is the place where third party application, right, wants to access your identity based on some other authorization server that is owned by some other company organization. For example, let's say in this particular case is your Google, right? Or it could be Microsoft, Facebook, or whoever support all these things. Now, so this was very 10,000 feet we were discussing, right? So let's deep dive and understand the terminologies of OAuth 2. Now, the first thing that comes in is the resource owner, right? So in this particular case, if I'm logging into a website, login using Gmail, so I am the resource owner. All right, resource server is the website that where I am logging into. All right, because that has the resources. Now you have a client, right? Client is the same web application, the UI, except assume that is UI, that from where you are trying to access the resources, right? For example, you are logging into ChatGPT OpenAI UI. That UI is working basically on some backend APIs, right? So that ChatGPT Open UI will be the resource. I am the resource owner. That will be the resource server. In this case, your authorization server will be your Google, right? Because that has your identity. You already have Google account, so you have the identity, right? So the flow, it will work. Everybody already know the flow. You, by this time, if you are watching this video, you must already know the flow. I'll tell you. So you go to chatgpt.openai.com, and there you basically log in. So when you log in using Gmail, right? So understand the flow. So this is your client, right? ChatGPT client, and this is your resource owner. So when you log in, it says, okay, I want to allow all these because these will be the resources that I will be accessing. So you said okay. By approving it, by giving your consent, you say okay, and then client has your consent. It sends it to authorization server, which is now your nothing but your Google, for example. Google will send, Gmail will send an access token back to the client. So it will tell, okay, this guy is basically verified and this is the token. We will understand later in the lecture that what is access token, that this guy is verified and has identity with me. So now this is the access token. Now if this particular guy, if you want to access any API, you can use this access token. Now client will have your access token. It will now send the resource server, right? Resource server, let's say your backend of your ChatGPT. So it will send the ChatGPT, the backend servers, it will call the API along with the access token. Now remember, in the backend, maybe your ChatGPT backend, maybe in the backend verifying your token with this authorization server. That step must also be called somewhere in the backend, right? So now once it passes the access token, it will give you the resource, right? That's how you call, right? From the client, you hit something, it will give you the result. But those are the APIs of models that they have exposed and being consumed by the web client application, right? Now by this time, you see, I have used different terms. For example, authorization grant, authorization request, access token, protected resource, etc., etc. Now let's go and understand what are these terms, right? So let's first understand the authorization grant, right? All right, so authorization grant is nothing but this is basically resource owners. For example, if I'm trying to access the chat GPT, so I'm the resource owner, right? So authorization grant is nothing but the representation of resource owner's credential, my credential, right? Now there will be different type of authorization grant. It also defines that how you are trying to authorize, how are you trying to grant the authorization. For example, you have a type authorization code. We will understand what is authorization code, right? Then you have implicit. It's kind of deprecated, nobody use it, and neither it is recommended to use, right? Then you have resource owner password credentials. You have client credentials. We will understand what are those, right? And then if you go to the lecture, then you will see like how it works and what are those, right? But understand that authorization grant is something that defines that what will be your grant type, how your grant type will be accessed, how your authorization will be granted, right, to the resource owner, right, on the behalf of resource owner. Access token is nothing but, for example, this string, this data that authorization server will send back. It will be an encrypted text, right, which will be sent back to client, right? So, for example, nobody will send you the details as it is, right? So what they do is they kind of encrypt the text in any format and then send it back to the client. So it's a string representation. I have mentioned here it's a string representation. Now access token could be anything, right? Access token could be anything. For example, there are opaque tokens. A lot of people use opaque tokens. So what you do is when you pass on, for example, if you are passing a username and password, it goes to your authorization server, let's say authorization authentication server, whatever you want to call, and it will say, okay, this guy is the correct guy. They will send you one token to use further, right? So those kind of string representation. Now there will be one question, okay, why are we using these access tokens? So access token contains some useful information about you, right? Some information about you. So let's say the next time when client is sending your access token to the resource server here, right? Now this guy will verify that you are the correct person. This access token is the correct person. So it carries some kind of data in it, right? So it goes back to the authorization server, and authorization server might have a way to decrypt the access token and understand this is the correct guy, right? So there are different type of access tokens. So one is the opaque, which is very clear, one very simple kind of string. Second one is the bearer, and then again the way you pass the access token in the APIs in the header section. So the general or standard way of passing access token in APIs in the headers using authorization. So authorization as the key, the value as bearer for bearer token. You pass the token here. So your token, for example, if you say bearer token, right? So if you want to see bearer token example, you see. So this kind of token, you see, did you see this kind of token you will have? This is very encrypted text, right? Which is a very encrypted text, right? So this will be your bearer token. Now after bearer token, so you also have JWT type, right? So for example, JWT type is very simple, right? If you go here, jwt.io, you go here. So this is your JWT token. You see this encrypted text. So this is carrying some information. For example, it has this data. It also has the algorithm it is using, right? It also has the name it has, right? It also carries the expiry time. So the interesting part is these access token has some kind of expiry time. For example, if you are granting me an access token, it's not like that access token will work for entire life, right? So even after 70 years later, you can come back and use the same access token. No, that's not work like that. To maintain the security, you have a limited period of time. You have a lifespan for that access token. So that means after some time that access token will get expire. You are supposed to request access token from the authorization server again, right? So the basic difference between the bearer token and the JWT. So most of the guys, what I've seen is they use JWT a lot of, right? For example, this carries issuer expiration permission that I already told you, right? and the validation can be done at the consumer end. I'll tell you how. And then here, if you see, authorization server does its validation and return the user related information here. And then this user doesn't contain any specific information. So what it means is, if you have a bearer token, right? So bearer token, you're passing that to resource server, for example here. Now, if resource server wants to verify its identity, if it's a correct token or not, the only way possible is you need to send this bearer token to this guy, authorization server. Authorization server can use any technique to maybe deserialize it, right? And then it will say your bearer token is, let's say, carrying 1, 2, 3 data. Then it will decrypt, deserialize it, and see it has 1, 2, 3 data. It will send it back to the resource server maybe, right? So resource servers cannot deserialize that. Only authorization server can do that, right? So that's the bearer token. But in case of JWT, that's not the case. JWT simply carries some information. For example, you see right here. So you already have built-in libraries in Java, Python, Node.js, whatever you use, right? You can decrypt, deserialize JWT token and understand the information. So let's say the one way of doing is you have the JWT token, the resource owner side. You also have a database. Then from the JWT, you have the ID, and then you look up into the database. If you are trying to get any record, user record, and that user record doesn't exist, that means it's an invalid token, right? Invalid data. So that's the basic difference between the JWT and the bearer token. Now let's move on, and then you have very interesting the refresh token, right? Let's also understand the concept of refresh token. So let's say you have your Facebook, you are logging into your Facebook account, correct? And then maybe when you are logging into your Facebook account, Facebook gives you an access token back with, let's say, 1 hour expiry time, correct? When it will send the access token back, right here, when it will send the access token back, it doesn't only send the access token back. In fact, it also sends the refresh token back, right? So there is a pair of access token and refresh token comes back. So let's say if I search here, access token and refresh token, if I say example, right? So you could see the example, for example, yeah. Oh, they have not given an example, but you can look around. There are a lot of, you see, okay, anyways, so access token, refresh token also looks like the access token, encrypted one, right? Encrypted text, but I'll tell you the difference. So refresh token is used to get the access token again. So for example, I'll tell you the life cycle. Understand the life cycle. The way it works is, authorization sends the access token back to the client, right? Or with expiry time of 1 hour. After 1 hour, when this client is accessed again by resource owner or by the user, then you see access token is expired, right? So with the moment client will send request to the resource server will say that it's unauthorized because it's expired, right? So in this particular case, your client has the refresh token. Now client will go back to the authorization server. It will send the refresh token and will get the access token again, right? And then using access token, you can again access the protected resources. So we will be covering all those parts you hear. Here I have already covered this part. We will be understanding this, right? So basically, your refresh token is used to again generate the access token right at the time it gets invalid. The access token gets invalid. For example, today you log in into your Gmail. For example, today you log in into your Facebook account. But you've seen that, right? Only maybe in the first time in the beginning, you have entered your username and password. Now, whenever you open your Facebook.com or your Gmail.com in your browser, you don't have to enter username and password again, right? Because of the fact they have a refresh token with the high expiry time. So whenever you go back, your access token expire, the request goes back to the authorization server, and then it generates the access token again, and then you keep on using those resources. That's how it works, right? Then let's move on and understand the life cycle, right? So I already explained you, right? Client will send the authorization grant. So and then this is life cycle, and then authorization server, by approving the consent and all those things, I have not covered that part because that's different. We are only talking about the life cycle. It will send the authorization grant, request for authorization grant basically, and then it will approve. Once it will approve, it will send the access token, refresh token. It will say 200. Client will use the access token to access the resources. So let's say the Gmail token is being used to access your ChatGPT backend APIs by the client, the UI part of it, right? Then again, you can use all these resources of ChatGPT APIs because all the modal APIs, and then now let's say you call API, etc. All those things happen. Now let's say the access token gets expired after 1 hour, or let's say 1 day, or whatever the expiry they are using, right? So now let's say you open your ChatGPT account again, and then you see you're trying to access it, you are trying to do something, and then when client calls the resource server, the ChatGPT, the backend API, it says it's unauthorized, right? We cannot process it. So there will be two-way happen. If they have handled in the way, they will reroute to you the login page again, one way. Second way, they will, if they have the refresh token, they will send the refresh token to the authorization server, you see right here, and then generate the access token, refresh token again. So your refresh token is used to generate the new pair of access token and refresh token again, right? Authorization server sends the AT and RT again, and then again client is able to access all the resources from the resource server, right? So this was the basic life cycle of access and refresh. So these are the important part, right? Now let's talk about the authorization grant type that I said in the here when we were discussing about the authorization grant, right? I said we will cover it later in the lecture. Now let's quickly cover it. So what happens in the authorization grant is you have user, for example myself, and then myself, I'm the resource owner. You have the client, which is let's say ChatGPT UI, right? And then you have the authorization server. Let's say this is your Google, and then this is your resource server, which is nothing but a ChatGPT backend APIs, right? I log in to my client, the ChatGPT API, right? Login using Google, right? So it send that request to your Google server, Google authorization server. It is owned by Google, right? Sitting in the Google infrastructure server. So it will send an authorization code request to your the Google authorization server. Then you might have seen that particular page where it says, okay, allow this or deny, right? Where it does ask for your content that as part of this allow, we will be using all this data. So that pop-up happens. What you do is you click on approve, you click on allow, you don't deny. So you allow, user allows, for example I allow. Once I allow that, Google has, okay, I have the consent, that means it's correct, it's being approved. So it sends an authorization code is nothing but a basic string, it's an identifier basically, which identify, okay, this has been granted, right? User has the consent, and then this is the authorization code, you have the code, right, for the user. Authorization server will send the authorization code to the client. Now the authorization code is being received by the ChatGPT UI. Now the ChatGPT UI sends the request to send a request to generate a new access token to the authorization server, but it passes the authorization code. So authorization server will understand, okay, this is the valid authorization code that I have sent back to a client, right? XYZ client maybe. So it will request, okay, give me the access token, refresh token, correct? And this is the authorization code. Then it will generate the access token and refresh token, send it back to the client. Now client has your access token, refresh token. Now whatever you type, like get me this or that to your ChatGPT model, it will get you all the data, right? So I'm taking an example of ChatGPT. It may work that way, it may not work that way, but this is the overall concept that you can apply, right? So understand the concept, the fundamental. So that's how your authorization code grant type works. So the user identifier is being represented and sent back as part of your authorization code. Authorization code indicates that the user has given already a consent to access his or her data which exists on Google server that can be used by the client which has requested the access, right? Which is the third party ChatGPT client. So this is authorization code. So most of the, let's say if you are sitting in an interview, and from the concept perspective, most of the time authorization code is something which is being adopted by the organization heavily, right? When the third party, when your the identity server exists somewhere else, and your UI exists somewhere else, the resource server exists somewhere else, right? And then you have your resource owner password credential. It's very simple, and this method is only recommended when, let's say, you have your Google, you are logging into a Google application, and then Google also has your identity, right? Those kind of places, because it's not recommended to use password based credentials, the grant type, because it has high risk. When you send your username and password, it sends the data. So it's recommended only when the application you are trying to access belongs to the same organization which has your identity as well. For example, if you're trying to log in into Google Docs, you already have the Google account, Google has your identity, and the Google Docs is the client application. So in those particular scenario, you can use the password credential grant type. For example, you see, it's very simple, right? You basically log in using your username and password. It requests for the authorization code, and then it gives you the access and refresh token. It calls API, etc., right? And then there is another, the client credential. It's very simple. I'll tell you. For example, if you have a server and then you have a Android application, then you are allowing that this particular API can be accessed from a client. When I say client, that means any Android application, a web browser, or any application can be accessed if the client is sending the request with this client credentials. So it's very generic, right? It's not any user specific role and permission. It's just that the clients want to access, but you need to also verify that the only client which has your credential is only sending and calling those APIs. So nobody else can call those APIs. So this is where you use your client credentials, right? So majorly you will be asked for authorization code, and this is a good understanding that you should know the in-depth of authorization code and also the password credential grant type, right? So by this time we have reached to the end of this lecture. If you really love this video, you can subscribe me on YouTube, right? And then you can follow me on LinkedIn, and then this is my GitHub repo. You can go and clone the projects, and more importantly, you can maybe subscribe to suchet.substack.com. If you have any suggestion, feedback, or any topic you want me to create content on, you can reach out to me at any of the media, or comment anything, right? Comment down that this is what you want next, then we will create that video. All right, so for this video, this is it. So we will meet in the next video with some other topic of backend engineering. Thank you so much, guys.